everyone. Thanks for coming. Hope lunch was good. Probably going to be in a food coma here soon. But so today I'm talking about a toolkit called Zoid. And it's a JavaScript toolkit for cross-domain messaging. And we're going to talk about more of what that is. But first, I just want to quickly go into who I am. So I'm Josh Greenwell. I grew up in Minnesota. I went to the University of St. Thomas for computer science. And out of school, I moved to California and started working at PayPal. I've been there for a little over 2 years now. And I've learned a lot of things. That's where I've found out about Zoid and started using it in my day-to-day life with a lot of the different products we're working on now. It's used in a lot of different ways. One of the main products that it's used in is the PayPal checkout button, which most people kind of see PayPal for, is that. In addition, we're using it in a lot of the newer products that are trying to complement the checkout button. And so it's starting to make its way across multiple different products within PayPal. So kind of the meat of what Zoid is dealing with is post messaging. So how many of you have heard of or used post messaging? Okay. Have any of you heard or used Zoid? No. So just a quick overview of what post messaging is. It's a method that safely enables cross-origin communication between windows, such as a third-party site and an iframe, or a pop-up and a website. And this is what the signature looks like. So some sort of target window. And then .post message, you give it a message and a target origin, and then potentially an array of transferables, but we won't talk about that part. And you would use it in such a way that you would create some sort of event listener for message, give it a function reference to do something on, yes?
Does the post message work between tabs, or is it only pop-ups and iframes?
I've only used it between pop-ups and iframes. I don't know if it works between tabs. I don't think so. Yeah. You give it a function reference here, and then when a message comes in, it'll be picked up by that function, and then you can do something with it. And then additionally, the next step, so that's part one. Part two is that you actually have to send a message from the other window. It can be on either the third-party site or your iframe that's sending the message, and the listener would be on the opposite end. So this is just a quick example of what post messaging is and how it might be used. And now I want to try and get into kind of the main things that Zoid is trying to help enhance with post messaging to give you a more seamless and simplistic implementation if you're trying to do something where you need to have a secure session like a window as an iframe or a pop-up and communication between that third-party site and your site. So these are kind of the 7 things it's trying to solve. The first 3 I'll talk about. This is just, say you're not using iframes at all. You're just saying, load my JavaScript file onto your site. You would potentially run into these issues. If you're dealing with components from different frameworks, say that the website doesn't have any framework or it has Angular or something, but you're using React. Now you're pulling in the whole React library, and they have Angular on their site, and that's all just existing in that one location. If you can sandbox that out into your own system or your own window, then it's just enclosed in its own little sandbox. In addition to that, one thing you might also run into is conflicting CSS properties. So say that you're being loaded on a website and they've overwritten some tag like the paragraph tag. Now all of your CSS or all of your HTML now is going to take on those CSS properties because you're not sandboxed out. And unless you overwrite them directly, now they're getting applied to your UI, potentially messing things up. Additionally, you have issues with data security potentially. Say you have a form that you want someone to fill out that gets brought onto a third-party site. Whatever data is entered into that form then is now readable by the third-party site because you're just existing on their website. Or say that you want to do something that's more personalized. You know who the person is because you're a different product and they've logged into you and you're saying, hey, Josh, welcome back. Do you want me to send you an email at your email? If you're not sandboxed out of that, now the third-party site can also get this personal information about different users. And then the third thing, if you're just going directly on the website, is you run into potential CORS issues. Say you need to make a back-end call. Well, now your code is running on a different site, and you have to go cross-origin to hit your back-end services. So if you just decide, yeah, I'm going to use an iframe, you can use post messaging or potentially URL params within the iframe, but now you have to manage everything else that is involved in that. So you'll have to set up a bunch of post messaging listeners. Say that you have, it's simple if you have just like one listener, but say you have 12 different things. Now you have to have 12 different listeners and your different post messages, and you have to manage that and make sure that it's keep track of all that across these two different areas, the two different windows. Additionally, if you say that you're dealing with errors, so your iframe doesn't load you get an error. You have to do all the error handling for that. You have to write the try catch, make sure that it doesn't break other things or that you can fail gracefully, give it a good experience for the user. And it also gives you that data security of, if I have a form in this iframe, the third-party site can't come in and look at what data exists there. Or if I have personal information being visually put on there, the third-party site can't look at that either. And that is a huge plus to the post messaging piece, but we can make that or help make you feel safer using Zoid, because everything exists in a more contained, clean way. And in doing that, it helps you feel more secure about the information that you're being passed around. So you don't have to manage all these listeners and all these post messages across these multiple windows. It could be 2 iframes. It could be an iframe and a pop-up and a third-party site, and you might have all these different things that you're now managing. And if you can create a more clean and simplistic way to manage that, you feel safer about your data not being exposed. So moving into that, on the Zoid website, this is a great quote that I found that kind of, in a really simplistic way, sums up what Zoid achieves for you. And it's a data down, actions up style components, but is 100% cross-domain using iframes and pop-ups. So what does that actually mean, though? That's kind of vague in terms of what you can actually do with it. So at this point, what I'd like to do is move into sort of like a tutorial, go through some of setting up a basic Zoid component on a website. So here I just have a really simple website. I brought in Bootstrap just to give a little bit of style to it and also to make a point later about this.
Can you make it bigger?
Yes. Yeah. Is that good? Okay. So just a basic website here, and then quickly I'll go over what I did for the HTML pieces, and then we'll go into kind of the meat of the JavaScript, creating the Zoid component, and then making that communication between the two different windows. So this is just some basic HTML code, and the real point is to look at is this piece right here, which is going to be the container that we want to render our iframe into. So you can put this anywhere, you give it some ID, and then when you're going to create the component or render the component, you give it the you give it the ID, and it renders that into this div. And then additionally, I brought in this JS file. So this JS file has all the code for creating the component and doing all the further customization that we're going to do with it. So that's just the parent page. Basically, if you were to give your SDK to a merchant or a customer or whoever and ask them to integrate, you would say, here's the SDK, such as parent.js, put that on your site, and then put this div somewhere, and then call some sort of init function, and you're done. You have your iframe, you have all the experience that we've created for you. So the child page is much more simplistic. Again, it has a child.js, and this would be like your site. So the thing that you're going to want to render into a secure iframe. Child.js we'll get into that. That's just the other end of the component. And then I just have a really simple UI, which is just an image of the Midwest.js logo, which we'll look at in a second. So in the child.js, we import Zoid, and we do this thing called Zoid create. So Zoid create, it gives you back a function that allows you to initialize a Zoid component. And when you create it, you want to give it some sort of tag and then a URL to what your experience is. The tag is important because the tag allows you to basically namespace your communications between the two windows. So if I have Zoid presentation tag, that's the iframe that gets loaded with the namespace Zoid presentation. On my parent site, if I create another connection to the Zoid presentation, the communication only goes between those two windows. It doesn't go to any other. So if there's 6 iframes, it only goes between those two. It doesn't go to child2.html. It doesn't go to child3. It only goes between those two. So it's namespaced that way. And you have to create a Zoid component on the child and create the same one with a tag on the parent. The reason for this is because each side of the component only goes halfway and waits for a connection from the other side. So a parent creates a Zoid component for Zoid presentation, goes halfway and waits for the child to say, hey, I'm here and listening as well. And then they make a connection between Zoid presentation parent and Zoid presentation child. So if we look at what's going on here, I did the same Zoid create, but I added a little dimensions field to say I want it to be a certain size iframe. And then I initialize the Zoid component with some options. Right now, the options are just an empty object. And then we'll look at what that component actually looks like when it's initialized. And additionally, I grab that element ID and I try and render into it. And so when we refresh the page here, you can see that now there is this iframe here, which we can look at. So it's got all this information. It's namespaced out. It's just an iframe that exists. Let me see if I can. Is that reasonable size? Can we see that? Just the gist of it. So it's created an iframe within this Zoid component div. And now you might notice that inside child, I put this class card text, which additionally exists over here in the paragraph for all the text up here. And the fonts are actually different because it is now sandboxed away. The CSS that Bootstrap is bringing in and applying to the page isn't existing within the iframe because it's its own window now. So there is no effect from the third-party page to my site of potentially having issues between the two CSS classes or being forced to namespace all your CSS classes with like your company or something. Okay, so at this point, that was kind of like a really quick jump into it. Is there any questions anybody has about what's going on? Any clarifications needed? Nope. Okay. So one thing we'll talk about next is something called the Prerender template. So say that your component needs to make some network calls and needs to take some time to load in because maybe it's asynchronously loaded on the page, so it gets loaded whenever it has time to. You may want something to exist in its place beforehand to show that it's loading or to give someone the experience before the functionality is actually there. And that's where pre-render templates come in. So for instance, if I just break this really quick, you'll see that it starts loading forever. This is by default. Zoid comes with this spinner as a preloading. So this loads really fast because all it is some HTML that's not doing really anything, and there's nothing else on the page. So you don't really see the pre-render, but if for whatever reason someone had a slow internet or you had to do a lot of stuff before it came in, you might see something beforehand. So by default there's a spinner, but you can either remove the pre-render completely or you can create your own pre-render of any sort of HTML you want. So let's look at what that might look like. So down here, so this is the same sort of initial structure we had up at the top, but I've now added an additional property to the create, which is the pre-render template. So you can create a function container template that gets a doc object, and that is the document of the pre-render itself. So we create an HTML element, and we create just a little paragraph tag and give it some text, append it to the HTML, and then just return that part of HTML. So you can make this as complex as you want. You could add CSS, style it. You could basically render what you're going to render, but without functionality yet. So for instance, if you had a button and some text, you could render that button, but it wouldn't do anything because your load hasn't finished yet. But it'd look like it's there, and then it would replace that button with an actual functional one when the load completes. So there's lots of things you can do with the pre-render template depending on what you're interested in doing. So if we do this again, it says, please wait while your component loads. So I've replaced the loader with some text, some HTML. And then after that, it goes in and then it replaces it with the actual content. So the next thing I want to talk about, kind of building on top of the pre-render stuff, is your context. So when we talked at the beginning about this, we said there are iframes, but there can also be pop-ups and potentially other different contexts that you might want to create for the windows. So by default, the default context is iframe, which is why without anything in there, it loaded as an iframe here. But you can give it a default context of pop-up, and now every time you load, it becomes a pop-up instead of a iframe on the page. So in between these two, you can communicate from this page to the pop-up and the pop-up back. But how would we go about doing that? So now we get into what sort of options would we pass? So for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to pass in something that's called alternate text and update background color. And these options are being passed from this parent page into this pop-up. So what we have to do in the pop-up is use those options. So what's nice about Zoid is that anything that's passed in from the parent page to the child page itself gets it in this nice little object on the window called xprops. And so when you access xprops, you have access to anything that was passed in, whether it's some sort of data, like a string or a number, or function references that reference back to the parent page. And so we'll look at an example of both of those here. So I created just grab the title element that's your site component and change the inner HTML to just be the alternate text, window.xprops.alternate text, because that was being passed in. And if we reload the page here, you'll see that it replaced your site with stuff. And additionally, if I click, it changes the background color of the content on the website. And that's because we additionally have, on click, it calls xprops.update background color. Because we passed in the function reference, the update background color function actually is pointing towards the parent page, and this is how you can pass data backwards. So if the parent page passes you data and then passes you some function, say you want to do like, hey, the form was submitted successfully, you want the third-party site or the parent page to know about that, they could pass in an onSuccess callback function or function reference, and then you would call it when the submit button was hit on your form. And that would send back, oh, it's successful, and then they would know that it was successful and they could do something based on that. So this is how the data goes both ways. Everything gets passed up to the child, and then the child itself manages how it wants to deal with it. So it uses the data that it's given, and then it also calls the functions to give data back to the parent page. So at this point, any questions on this or any further explanation on how it could be used? No? Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is props validation. So in addition to being able to send different props, we also can be picky as the child window about what we will allow or won't allow. And this is where your security point comes in, because you can say, if you don't give me this, then I won't render, or if you try and give me like weird data that doesn't fit my validation, I won't render, or whatever. So we can look at how that works. So again, everything's the same up here. We're basically just continuing to add on to this singular create at this point to give it more and more options for customization depending on what you're looking for. And this is the addition we made for this. The props field here, you can start giving it what data you expect, if it's required, what type it's expecting, and then we'll go into a little bit deeper of like how to validate actual values in a minute. So for instance, if I'm expecting that alternate text is a string, if I try and pass in my options something like a number, then what we will see is that props does not type string. Props does not type string alternate text. So it's not rendering the iframe or the pop-up. It's saying, hey, you did something wrong. Your data doesn't match our typing. So we're not going to render. We're going to tell you so that you can change that. Additionally, so for the props validation, we made update background color a required parameter or required prop. So if you don't pass this, we're going to say, hey, we need that for our pop-up to work because it's a core piece of the functionality. So we're making it required. If you don't have it, we're also going to tell you that there's an error. So again, it says expected prop update background color to be defined. So you haven't passed it in. And so it'll tell you, hey, you need to do that. But what if you want to go like a little bit further on validation? You want to actually say, I need to look at what data you're sending me, and I want to make sure that it's good. It's not going to cause me problems, or it's within some set of specifications more than just a type. So that's where props validation part 2 comes in. And we'll just look here. In this, we've decided that alternate text can't be the word, or can't include the word people for whatever reason. So say that you want to exclude certain characters. You could do a regex here, or say that you wanted to check for specific, like it has to be some specific thing, some sort of string, some sort of email, has to be certain character length, or different validation things you might want to do here. You can do it via this validate function. So you create one, you get the value in the props, and we'll log those out and look at them. And then you just do some checking here. So if there is some issue, then I'll throw an error with the information. So I'll say, hey, you can't have spaces. You can't have dashes or special characters, or it has to be 8 characters long, or something like that. You can do all that here in this validate. So if I change the value in here to be something like that, people are here. When I refresh, it says bad text friend. And that's because when it went into this validation, we can see that the value as people are here, it gives all the different props, like the alternate text, a bunch of different things down here, and then it says that's true. It does include people, so we're going to throw the error of bad text. So any questions at this point? Okay. So one of the next things I want to talk about is the support that Zoid has across frameworks. So what I just showed you was a very straightforward, basic part of creating customizations for what you might need for your component, and additionally, some really basic passing of data and functions to the child window so it can do whatever it wants to do and then deal with data passing back and forth. But it also supports React, Angular 1 and 2, Glimmer, and Vue. And a quick example, just using the React example, is you would create something, so my Zoid component.driver, and you would give it like Angular, React, whatever. And then in some cases, there's additional properties that you can give. So for React, you can give it React DOM. And then when you decide to render your component, so for in React, it's render, and then you return my Zoid component, it will have compiled it correctly for React versus just doing it natively. And that will work for all of the frameworks above, and we can actually quickly look at an example of what that'll look like for the other ones as well. So real quick, how many people use React in here? How many people use Angular, Vue? Okay. Yeah, so support for all of you. Zoid.js. So we go to the Zoid website here, and we go to API docs. We can look at examples of each of these. So for instance, for Angular 1 and 2 people, it would look something like this. Again, using the driver, Angular 2. And then you use it how you would in your normal use case. And then also for Vue. Pretty much like that. And so, yep, at this point, I will answer any questions people have about, yeah.
So we do some post messaging stuff, and it gets a little hairy. There's one situation where we're trying to load basically an HTML document from an API, and we need to authorize that request to do that. And so we had to build something, basically something that would post into an iframe with the access token in the body, so that if someone was sniffing traffic, like, couldn't put the access token in GIF. But it doesn't seem like Zoid does anything like that for people, like trying to do post bodies into iframes.
Yeah. Yeah, so the data being passed between the two is like public data, right? So it's the parent sending data to you, and then it's the iframe, when it calls the functions, it's sending whatever data the iframe decides it will allow to be public back, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you would still have to post into the iframe to do the authentication. But if you do other messaging between the two windows, you could create the Zoid component and set up that messaging and load basically an empty page initially, so it's like invisible.
Yeah.
and then do that post. And if the post was successful in the iframe, it then renders something.
Yeah, and we're having to then, once that document loads up, figure out how large it is on the page, tell the parent how big to make the iframe to show the entire thing.
Yeah. So.
Something that is handled.
Yep. So there actually has a auto resize. Zoid has an auto resize. You can choose to auto resize width or height or both, so that as the iframe changes in size, it'll actually, or as the your document changes in size, it'll actually auto adjust the size of the iframe to the size of whatever your inner stuff is. Other questions? Okay, well, that's pretty much the gist of it. If you have any questions about any more advanced stuff within Zoid, feel free to talk to me at any point. Thank you.